All right. There's some cool charts in this chapter, actually. Diagrams. You can get a lot from the diagrams and the tables in this chapter. And so this one is about diseases, the diseases that have emerged in response to changes in human societies. Actually, that's just a good thing to pause upon here is that we often think of disease as something that happens to us from the outside. But in fact, many of our diseases, the things that afflict us, are in part a cycle of human culture and society. I'm not trying to say that all these things are bad in human life, but a lot of the things that we do, like agriculture, brings with it some things that are not so great. So it might have been healthy overall, but as we've talked about, for example, when you clear land in various parts of the world and have irrigation, it promotes things like malaria, which is still a huge killer, ravaging and killer disease in many societies of the world. But it comes to us from quite long ago with the intensification of agriculture. We see here in this chart, we talked about this, the intensification of agriculture and social differentiation, some of those inequalities that we talked about. And that in fact, when you start to rely on one crop or start to monocrop, then the risk of famine or starvation actually increases. And, well, there's something you never heard of. Pellagra. Where does that come from? It actually comes to us a little bit from eating one thing and not getting enough vitamins and minerals because we've been eating too much of one crop. And so your textbook places this back around 10,000 years ago. And it's probably true that in some ways, some of these early agricultural societies, that when we saw there was a shift towards a less balanced and maybe not as nutritious diet as might have been under hunting and gathering. That said, in some of the major parts of the world where these things like corn, maize, or potatoes were domesticated, they did not have monocropping problems. If you travel to Mexico or Peru, the homeland of corn and potato domestication, you will see that they have many, many different varieties of corn and many, many different varieties of potatoes. And they are mixing those with other natural ingredients which are domesticated in that area to achieve a balanced diet. The problem actually is when you remove those crops from the areas and then start to use only one variety, and you start to eat too much of it, excluding other things. And so corn is an example that in various parts of the world, people would have imported it from where it was originally domesticated, and it got grown all over the place, including among my ancestors in northern Italy, and it was so cheap that people ate a whole bunch of it and didn't have enough money for other ingredients. And since they didn't know how to traditionally mix it with the things that you needed to mix it with to get proteins and other nutrients, they ended up being malnourished and not having, they would have full bellies, but not have enough nutrients. So this happened in various parts of the world. It happens with sometimes with potatoes and sometimes with corn, but usually in places where they don't really know how to grow them correctly. Back 10,000 years ago, in what is now Mexico and what is now Peru, they did not have these kinds of malnutrition problems. Now, what we do see is once urban societies came along, the intensification of agriculture and the intensification of social settlements, we do see since around 5,000 years ago what is called the First Epidemiological Transition, in which our deadliest diseases began to spread. Things that are still with us today. flu, which, by the way, turns out to be much more devastating and deadly than many people realize. So you might want to think about that. Measles, which we thought we had eliminated in this country, basically, but if you've been reading the news, it seems like about 500 people have measles now all over the place. Mostly in West Texas, but in different parts of the world as well, and the United States. Typhoid, basically eliminated in the United States, but still a problem in many countries. Smallpox, hopefully eliminated. And tuberculosis, which is actually still, a lot of people don't realize this, worldwide, it is still the largest, is still the main killer of human beings. It's the infectious disease that kills the most people worldwide is tuberculosis. Most of these things are entirely preventable now. We made great strides. Most of these things are either preventable or can be at least controlled with vaccines. And so this was a great public health innovation to vaccinate people. Just say it's a little tiny bit scary that people are not getting vaccinated for things like measles. And that's coming back. I want to tell you what to do, but just remember that these were the big childhood killers, and they had been for 5,000 years. There was great advancements made to ameliorate them. Even tuberculosis can be cured for not very much money, but we've cut the money to those programs. So it's a weird time when the things that killed us 5,000 years ago are coming back. So we have this first epidemiological transition. We then have they talk about since about 500 years ago, the transmission of diseases between continents. This was basically a one-way thing from the European societies who had things like smallpox for a long time. And a lot of these diseases were very devastating to the indigenous or the Native American peoples because they did not have resistances to smallpox. A lot of these diseases came about because of the Eurasian agricultural complex, which combined domesticated animals and domesticated plants. In the Americas, there was much more domestication of plants than of animals. They did not have large animals to plow things like cows and horses. And so they did not actually have these diseases as much. And so this was a huge killer of indigenous populations, especially smallpox, and especially in the first couple hundred years there until things evened out. The only disease that it is possible that came from the Americas and was inflicted on the rest of the world that we know of is syphilis. And there's some debate about whether that actually originated in the Americas or not, but people say it. People say it may have been more of a America's thing but the rest of them, the plagues and stuff like that, were transmitted basically from the Eurasian populations onto the Americas. Desalinization is great, but many of our cancers and toxic stuff seem to come from that. And then they get into today's world. We have to realize that many of the things like famines and malnutrition because of monocropping actually have occurred in the last 300 or 400 years. They are not as ancient as we might think. Some interesting stuff has happened. Interesting, in part because of people, they say climate change induced, people clearing forests and getting closer to wild animal populations than may have been in the past. So, for example, well, Rayleigh, where we get HIV from, probably. Yeah, so and obviously, there's still some debate about where exactly COVID-19 came from. But even if you're a lab leak theory person, it was probably from some strain of wild animal which was then being experimented on, or it probably was a wild animal in a in a market selling these kinds of things. So our climate change and high-speed international travel actually helps us out with things like COVID-19, as we all know about. probably HIV, things like Ebola and cholera. So again, this is an interesting little disease chart to think about when we're thinking about humans and their relationship to diseases. Many of these things, we think of them as coming to us from natural or causes, but they're going to cycle with human beings. Another cool chart, this is on page 440, talks to us about terms that we in our everyday life probably use as synonyms or have never thought about as differentiating. And there is obviously overlap in these terms, but in as in anthropology and other social sciences, we also tend to separate these terms out a little bit to give a sense of there's a little bit of difference here. Well, what's the difference between illness and disease? Okay, so disease we tend to use more to refer to what can be diagnosed, the clinical stuff, whereas illness is how you start to feel about it, which is related to the disease, but different people feel diseases in different ways and can conceive them differently. I think you had an example. Yeah. So that brings us into a little bit into the sickness part of things, which is how we socially think about what's going on and how we recognize or not, and what expectations we have of people. And so, again, I'm not asking you to memorize these terms, but I'm asking you to think about these different aspects. You have the diagnosis of disease, you have the experience of it, and then you have the social ideas about it. So that's a good example. If you are trained in your society to look down whenever your elders are speaking to you, then if you confront a doctor who's trying to diagnose you for something like autism, where eye contact might be seen as an indicator or not, then you might get a misdiagnosis. So it's important to think about these things, our societal expectations, our individual feelings, and the actual diagnosis of disease. In some ways, if we think this is something that we can think about in terms of sex and gender and the biological aspects of sex and the social aspects of gender, you can see it's something to think about. There's overlaps, but there's differences as well. Now, for those of you who are thinking that social stuff, it doesn't matter, I would also just say that what's interesting and we're figuring out over the years is that the human body is also a host to all kinds of bacteria and little organisms that live in and around our bodies and on them. Some of these microorganisms, like the bacteria in our guts, we need in order to digest our food and to survive. And so some of you might be getting into your gut health and your microbiome. This is something that is actually trendy and will probably be more important as we learn more about it, making our healthy balance of bacteria in our guts. The interesting thing, at least maybe for me and for anthropology, is that we actually have more non-human bacteria cells living in and around our body than we have human body cells. So we're actually, as we walk around, we have more bacteria living with us and on us and in us than we have human cells. We're the host for more of them than they are of us. Some of them are essential for our survival. Others are just hanging out. So there is a social aspect even to being a human as we think about our health and our condition. I want to do the healing chapter before I did the dying chapter because I figure we try to heal people and then sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But how long has this been going on? How how long have we been trying to heal people? 40,000 years. In fact, the Neanderthals, there's evidence that it goes back for quite a while. And so this is something that is very fundamental to the human lineage, which we definitely we don't see as much in other creatures, is that we care for our the people who are ill or the people who are sick around us. And so there are several bases for this. One is that humans, like other primates, we have a high need for social activity and social cooperation, but we also have what we call empathy. So empathy is kind of like sympathy. Sympathy is when you're caring about somebody else, but empathy is when you not only care about somebody, but you're putting yourself in their position. And you're trying to imagine what it is like to live from their perspective. This seems to be a rather uniquely human capacity. We can't ask the bear or the deer if they have empathy, but we don't seem to see them doing this. This seems to be something that humans can be quite good at, although some people believe that our levels of empathy are getting less in our society. Hopefully not, but that's just a basic human thing. Also, and this is probably where most people would turn first, it is really only among human beings that we recognize what a disease is. We try and make some diagnosis and we accumulate, pass on knowledge about that and what to do about it. And this happens in all human societies, is trying to figure out what to do when someone gets ill and passing that knowledge on to other people in the next generation. So this leads to an interest. The humans save people, and the example from the Neanderthals is interesting because it seems like this is also in other human lineages. They keep people around and keep them patched together, even if they are not perhaps immediately useful to the group. And it relates to some of these basic human things that we do. One of the things that we do as human beings, of course, is experience pain. And as I said, we are also can be empathetic to others' pain. That is, we can put ourselves in the position of other people and imagine that pain. How painful is it? Yeah, there was an interesting table there of different people in the same society. And that's why I was asking you how painful it is to go through childbirth, because as men in this society, they actually ranked that super high. They said, hey, that is one of the most they ranked their wives or their sisters' childbirth pain as one of the a more painful thing than they would ever experience, like a kidney stone, which does really suck. What's interesting in this chart, though, is it's a little bit slightly different, is that the people in this, they were talking about two different groups of people who live in Fiji. And the people who were the indigenous Fijians, they did expect a level of pain in childbirth, and they knew it was painful, but they were prepared for it. And it wasn't like they wanted it. It wasn't like they were saying it was enjoying, but it was seen as a valuable experience on the way to motherhood. And there are different societies which have rituals which involve pain, where in some ways you're supposed to go through the pain. That's part of the ritual that's important to do. I'm not sure if that applies to our current use of tattoos, that you're supposed to go through the pain to get to somewhere else, but maybe that's relatable. For other people in this society, the pain was very frightening because they weren't prepared for it. They knew it was going to be bad and then they weren't prepared. And so, yes, it is interesting to think about how actually there is a variability in terms of pain across different societies. Not necessarily that other people don't feel pain, but you might experience it or value it in different ways. And also within different societies, which might be influenced by things like whether you're a woman or a man, whether you're rich or poor, old or young. So again, one of the main points of this is that health, illness, all those things is a social experience. This also applies to how we communicate or what is going on with us. Your textbook gives you the interesting example of in Haiti where they would express what they were feeling, and the doctors heard it as my head hurts or my heart hurts. And so they'd give them drugs for either headaches or heartache, indigestion. But actually, in this society, these were not meant to be symptomatic descriptions. They were actually signs of distress, which had to do with their emotional state and so what they really needed in this instance were resources which would help out with their situation, not drugs. Although sometimes you do need the right drugs too. But this is an example of how we communicate illnesses and stuff like that.